Tombstone.
Tombstone. Chris, it's time to wind up the old Popstorian clock. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
The Popstorian Podcast with Chris and Ben.
Wait a minute. You ain't heard nothing yet.
Greatest crash in the history of the New York Stock Exchange in March.
A date which will live in infamy.
I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore.
What are you supposed to do when you see the flash? Duck and cover.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Well, I'm not a crook.
Might have gotten away with it, too. If it wasn't for these blasted kids and their dog.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
The evil of the thriller.
I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you.
Great power comes great responsibility.
This is a full-length, full-tilt boogie episode of the Popstorian Podcast.
It is our 10th episode.
Yes.
Counting from Western by the decade.
We're 10, Chris.
We're at 10.
We're now older than both of your kids combined.
Wow. When you think about it that way.
When you think about it that way.
Yeah. We do have one more episode for Westerns by the decade, and then we're done.
Yep. So I guess this kind of marks, not really, but 10 episodes, 10 decades, kind of 100 years. It's not really.
Just about, yeah.
Well, no, actually it is, because 1903 to 1993.
Yeah.
It's pretty much 100 years right here.
Exactly.
So yeah, as we said before the credits, we're talking about Tombstone today.
Right. And this is our 100th year mark of film history right here. That's why they released it in 93, isn't it?
I think so.
Okay. That makes sense. I was like, wait, that's way too way too coincidental.
There's definitely some connections going on there, because you've got Harry Carey Jr. in the movie, and
Robert Mitchum.
Harry Carey Sr. was working with John Ford in the days when Wyatt Earp would have been hanging around Hollywood.
Yeah, and
so
then
kind of a direct link, almost
there. 6 degrees to Wyatt Earp. Harry Carey Jr. worked with John Ford a lot as well, and then worked with John Wayne in his production company. But Robert Mitchum narrates this film. Charlton Heston, major movie star, but also did a lot of Westerns as well. They're both in this movie as well.
Is this Kurt Russell's first Western? Or did he do one before this? I should know that.
I don't know. I'm not as familiar with Kurt Russell's early career, other than I know he did some Disney movies. He was a pretty big star by this point. It's interesting. He's done quite a few Westerns after this film.
Yeah, I was going to say this might be the first time that he really kind of takes flight as a Western star.
It is.
I know before this he was known for Escape from New York and The Thing, and Big Trouble in Little China.
Right.
Those were kind of his breakout films. But
star.
Since then, he's made Hateful Eight and Bone Tomahawk. Isn't he in that?
Bone Tomahawk.
So he's kind of a modern Western icon.
Yeah, but not as, I guess so. Not as much as his co-star, Sam Elliott, in this film.
Right.
Actually, it's kind of hard to find any movies that Sam Elliott is not playing a Western star.
Yeah. Even when he's not in a Western, he's kind of got a Western vibe.
It's the voice. You can't get past the voice.
And the mustache. He's in The Big Lebowski, which is kind of he plays kind of a cowboy narrator.
I've actually never seen Big Lebowski. It's kind of been on my list of movies to watch.
My wife has never seen it either, so we'll have to watch it together.
I love the way that works out. It's like, well, your wife's never seen it and you've never seen it, so let's just watch it together. We'll have a movie viewing party.
But as often happens with us, we've drifted away from Tombstone. So I think we need to do our traditional long rambling summary.
Right. Sure. I was thinking about plagiarizing Wikipedia, kind of reading their synopsis, just to speed things along, but I think that would be cheating. So
like
we must...
our last movie, Silverado, Tombstone is kind of a long, rambling ensemble piece, although not quite to the extent that
Not really to that extent, no. There is one major character in the film. That's Wyatt Earp.
I'll give you 10 guesses.
So when you start the movie off, it actually starts off with some footage from the Great Train Robbery, our first episode.
Yep.
And they talk about the Cowboys, which in the film, I believe they kind of describe them as one of America's first organized crime syndicates.
Right, yeah.
And so you kind of see them, you go, and they end up in this town ready to ambush this Mexican couple who has just gotten married.
Mm-hmm.
And apparently he had killed two of their compatriots, and they're there for revenge. And so they then in turn massacre the entire wedding party.
Yeah.
And
right down to the priest in the end.
Well, the priest is last. He starts yelling at them from the Bible and tells them that vengeance will rain down on them. And then he is killed. And was it Michael Biehn? Is that how you say his name?
I believe so.
He plays Johnny Ringo, and he translates this as a part from Revelation where a pale rider will come.
Right.
And
Johnny Ringo being a real historical figure.
Is he? I have not done that research on that.
He is. I don't think he's popped up in our previous. He didn't
pop up.
Wyatt Earp. He
didn't pop up in My Darling Clementine. I have not done a whole lot of the research for Wyatt Earp on this episode.
Yeah, we did a lot of. If you want to know more about Wyatt Earp and the myth versus the reality
mythology thing,
check out our My Darling Clementine episode.
Which that's another thing. This is our second historical-ish Western and our second Western about Wyatt Earp. So
a very different approach here.
Yes. So anyway,
this opening sequence feels almost spaghetti Western, though, in a way. The kind of it's definitely something that you couldn't have done before the revisionist Western era because of its brutality and just general maturity, I guess.
And it's something that the 1990s is that they're trying to, I guess, and particularly in this film, is that they try to pull everything from the past 90 years plus making it more realistic, if that makes sense.
Right. And it does feel a bit, we can get into this later, but it does feel like a bit of a hodgepodge of different styles and elements kind of thrown together. But anyway, we cut away from our banditos to the Wyatt clan, or the Earp clan, sorry.
Well, Wyatt Earp, it's kind of it. Anyway, he gets off the train, and they're trying to recruit him to be a marshal again, which he says, I'm retired.
Before they even finish their pitch, he's confirming that he's retired, and he's basically come with his brothers to settle down in this up-and-coming town and get rich, make some money.
Yeah. So Tombstone actually was an up-and-coming town during the latter part of the 19th century. It was a boom town, and it was actually, as they portray it, very very cosmopolitan. minus the whole Wild West element to it, gunshots being fired at the OK Corral and all that.
Right.
But they had theaters. They had a lot of, I guess, gaming establishments, as you kind of see in this part of the film.
Do you remember what brought the boom there? Was it the railroad?
It was silver.
Silver. Okay.
It was silver mining. So, which is another big difference. My Darling Clementine, the Earps come with as cattlemen,
right?
Which you can't really do any cattle out there. It's very hard to do cattle out there, even though there are some ranches. But it was mainly silver mining.
Would that be the absence of grassland?
Yeah, it's very arid.
Some difficulty.
A little bit, yeah. Plus, I think Tombstone is close to the desert, so.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, moving on. He's reunited with his two brothers, Morgan Earp, or Morgan and Virgil,
mm-hmm.
who are played by
Bill Paxton and Sam Elliott, respectively. Morgan Verge.
And their wives, which we were introduced to Wyatt Earp's common law wife, who is apparently addicted to laudanum.
She's having a rough time of it.
Yeah. I'm trying to remember what comes after this part.
I believe this is when they get involved with the Oriental, which is a saloon in town that's kind of known for its crookedness, I guess, and is also not super popular with the populace because of its crookedness.
Well, it's just this one table guy who's played by Billy Bob Thornton.
He's bullying everybody.
Yeah, he's a bully. He doesn't deal straight. So no one wants to go in there except people who are really desperate and been thrown out everywhere else.
Right.
So Earp goes in and says, if I get rid of him, you can get me part of the table or something like that. And so basically he chases him out. The dealer is played by Billy Bob Thornton in one of his early roles. And it's one of the more iconic scenes in the film, challenging him without drawing his gun.
Yeah, and it definitely is a good example of kind of a Teddy Roosevelt. Well, not Teddy Roosevelt. That's the wrong. He's more speak softly, carry a big stick. He kind of uses a. He has an authority from having confronted and having his reputation that he doesn't even have to draw a gun to scare off his enemies.
And he doesn't even introduce himself in the scene. He just kind of walks up to him and knows that
he calls his bluff, essentially.
Yeah, as this bully, he's always bluffing. So he goes, "Go ahead, try it." Which I think is actually quite historical in tone,
mm-hmm.
If not in actual events, because Wyatt Earp was known of going in and not pulling his gun on people, but kind of just talking them down and then hitting them over the head and dragging them off to jail.
This is where the movie starts to get interesting for me because it's a different kind of approach to the kind of gunslinger movie that you might be expecting.
Mm-hmm.
It's much more of a dialogue-driven kind of film. And you say that, and it sounds like, oh, it's really talky. But the dialogue is really, really well written.
It is. There are several parts that are just famous for the not just for this, really kind of just some of the wit that's in it, and particularly Val Kilmer's character, mm-hmm. Doc Holliday, who is introduced at this time.
Yeah. So I believe he's is it the guy who he kicks out, the bully?
Yeah, he's coming around with a shotgun.
He goes and gets a shotgun because he's mad.
Yeah.
And he doesn't realize that he's tangling with Wyatt Earp.
Yeah. And so he comes around the corner and he's like, "Doc?" And apparently Doc Holliday had dealings with him before. He's like,
Right.
hello. It's like, this is Wyatt Earp. And then they start talking because they're old friends by this point.
Right, so Doc and Wyatt are reunited. Doc kind of saves his life or gives him a heads up that this clown is coming after him with a shotgun.
Yeah, but it's kind of funny here is because Billy Bob Thornton's character is just kind of dumbfounded. And then Doc Holliday turns to him and he's like, oh, are you still there? I kind of forgot about you. I love that scene anyway. But Wyatt Earp's like, just leave the shotgun. And he kind of wanders off.
Wow.
And you never see him again, actually.
Nope, he disappears.
The film.
So we're introduced to Val Kilmer's Doc Holliday, who looks very tubercular.
Much more so than, say, Victor Mature was in the My Darling Clementine film.
He's very ill the whole time. I think are we at the point where the cowboys ride into town?
They are introduced to the cowboys through Harry Carey Jr., who's talking about them as kind of being the real law. And then they're also introduced to the county sheriff, who is trying to get them to buy some land.
Right. Is he the sheriff or the mayor?
He's the sheriff. The mayor also plays a part in the film.
Right. So at this point, they're kind of meeting everybody in town and getting the lay of the land.
Right.
I think our female lead is introduced around this time. She rides into town on a stagecoach.
Who plays her?
Oh, Dana Delaney, I think.
Dana Delaney.
I'm gonna look it up real quick.
Okay. No, it is. I looked it up. Dana Delaney.
She delivers an excellent performance, I think.
She also rides with Billy Zane. There's a lot of names on here.
Right.
Like people that you would see and recognize in other films, people who become a little bit more famous later on.
Mm-hmm.
Like of course, Bill Paxton's pretty young in this, but you also have Michael Rooker shows up in the film, Billy Zane, Stephen Lang. Quite a few folks here. But anyway, so while Wyatt Earp is kind of dealing with his feelings about whether he stays with his drug-addicted wife or run off with an actress, Doc Holliday becomes sicker, and things become more tense with the cowboys as they have continued run-ins with each other back and forth. One particular event happens when I guess things really start rolling here with Curly Bill, who is the leader of the cowboys, gets high off of opium and starts shooting up the town. And they send the sheriff or the town marshal out, who's played by Harry Carey Jr. Mm-hmm. And Curly Bill shoots him. And they send him off to jail, but he is acquitted for lack of witnesses.
Right.
Emphasizing
Not
that whole
historically accurate, I think.
But it emphasizes in the story how they are kind of control the town.
Right.
But the law can't touch them.
Mm-hmm.
And so the mayor, who is, I forget who plays the mayor here. Let me look that up real quick. I don't think it says. He's a character actor. I've seen him in a lot of other things too.
Mm-hmm.
But I forget who he is. Anyway, he's trying to get the Earps to become town marshals, and they turn him down, saying that we're here to get rich, we're here to make money. And Virgil kind of can't take it anymore, and so he becomes town marshal. This part actually is historically inaccurate because Virgil became a federal marshal. He was deputy federal marshal at this point, not necessarily just the town marshal.
Interesting.
At least that's what I recall from the research.
It's an interesting scene because it doesn't portray Wyatt Earp in the best light exactly. It kind of depicts him as
a reluctant hero kind of guy.
Yeah, as kind of a greedy capitalist almost. He wants to make money and he doesn't want to get involved in the fight or the entangled in all the stuff that comes with trying to bring justice to the town. He just wants to conduct his business.
Yeah, and stay out of trouble, basically.
He's very angry at Verge for getting involved. So it's an interesting character moment.
But there is another dust up, and they arrest a few of the cowboys, including Ike Clanton.
Played to perfection by Stephen Lang.
And I think they arrest him for being drunk, if I recall correctly.
Right.
There's several kind of almost everything coming to head, and things just kind of settling down. So Stephen Lang is out of jail for being drunk, and then they kind of one of the big thing here, forgetting an important part, is that Virgil, the marshal, has put up a no guns allowed in the town order.
Now, this is interesting.
Cowboy...
I think we've talked about gun control a little bit before, but it's interesting that it's not, again, and I think we've said this, I don't remember which episode we've talked about this before on, but the idea of gun control is not new.
No, not at all. And it's interesting in this film, they depict a pretty angry mob for having this edict put up, and Virgil's explaining to them, is like, I'm not saying you can't own a gun, that you can't even carry a gun, you just can't carry a gun in town. And a lot of people are angry about that, and that's an interesting moment because this is the early 90s.
Right.
That is becoming an issue. That became an issue in the 80s, and it's becoming even more of an issue in the 90s.
Right, the fears of escalating crime.
Right, you'll see some of the results of that when I switch over to some of the events happening in the 90s. But yeah, it's interesting to kind of see that real life being portrayed here. And then the Cowboys kind of throw this edict out the window as they assemble at the OK Corral, and they kind of saying, we're going to wait for you, which is interesting because in My Darling Clementine, the gunfight of the OK Corral is the climax, the end of the film. It's the big shootout.
Right.
In this film, it's the big shootout, but it's in the middle of the movie. This is the, I don't know, you call this an apex? It's not a climax, but
kind of like a midpoint.
It's a turning point in the film. It's this big deal. And so, and this part I think is portrayed actually very historically accurate as they're walking down the middle of the town, also kind of reminiscent of The Wild Bunch, another film we've talked about.
Yeah.
Virgil's holding a stick, which was switched because he had a shotgun, but then they switched it out to Doc Holliday's stick in the movie, that is. And so they're walking up the street, and the words that you hear in this gunfight is like, "I don't want this," or some of the other exclamations that they're saying is supposedly what witnesses actually heard when they were actually having the trial after the gunfight of the OK Corral. So there actually was a law case after that.
Yeah, they're moving towards the corral to go and disarm the Cowboys.
Yeah.
I don't remember why is it that Doc and Wyatt are involved in helping Verge disarm them.
Well, Wyatt's
some sort
involved
of an incident that led to that?
Not really. It's just his brother, and so he's like, "All right, you better swear me in because it's going to be trouble if you keep this up."
Yeah, and
so he gets sworn in.
There's
and
already kind of bad blood
along
between them and the Clantons.
Yeah, and Doc comes along, and in the movie you kind of see this character development between Doc and Wyatt Earp. That Wyatt Earp's Doc's only true friend.
Right.
Doc Holliday has been a gambler and a gunfighter for, I guess, all of his adult life, and he's never had a true friend. And Wyatt Earp kind of portrays that issue, and so he does everything he can in the movie to protect Wyatt Earp.
Mm-hmm.
And so he joins them, going down there as well. And then as I guess things happen in a standoff, someone loses their nerve and they start pulling the triggers, and it's a lot of firing going back and forth. And this is actually quite historically accurate because typically in like those Western gunfights, they weren't aiming and knocking the holes out of the aces. They were shooting a lot of bullets at one another at close range, and not very accurately. And in this sequence, I think that is portrayed very well, in that context.
Yeah,
Stephen Lang.
That, go ahead.
I was just going to kind of move on with Stephen Lang's Ike Clanton. Well, I love him mentioning him. What were you saying?
Well, on the way to the corral, the sheriff, I guess he calls himself the sheriff.
He's a county sheriff. Yeah.
Right. Runs up for the county. That's a city problem. He runs up to them as they're like moving towards this standoff. They're all in black and they're obviously going to take it to the next level if they need to. And he says he's already disarmed them. And they kind of ignore his claim that he's disarmed them and move on anyway.
Yeah.
Which I think is interesting. Then the other level of it is that one of the characters, I believe the one who's murdered, or killed rather, Billy Clanton, I think is the one.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, in the film and in real life, hits two of the Earps.
Yeah.
Hits one in the calf and the other in the wrist. So it just kind of reinforces that idea that there was a lot of shots being fired and some might hit, some might not.
There was a lot of shots fired, yeah. And that brings up a good point that I kind of forgot, was that the county sheriff was at odds with kind of the federal side of things. So I think we talked about it a little bit in My Darling Clementine, was that the backstory of this is going on is that the county, like the ranchers and the folks outside of the town, were having a hard time kind of keeping cordial with the town folk, who were very much pro-Union versus pro-Confederate. And that Civil War ghost keeps popping up there as well.
Right, yeah.
And so that's another kind of element. They don't express that specifically in the movie, but that happens in the historical story. And so I kind of see that with the county sheriff being like, these are the cowboys, I'm kind of with them because they represent this one side of the deal, while the federal marshals keep wanting to get the Earps involved on the other side of that. And so you still have that dynamic, the country versus the town idea.
Yeah.
But anyway, you're right. Also, two of the Earps are wounded in this conflict, in this little battle here. And that will play a part in the next big scene, because the cowboys have their revenge. Because they'll kill Bill Paxton's character, Morgan, and they will shoot Virgil again. And he barely makes it.
Yeah, he's very severely injured.
Yeah. So Wyatt is kind of like, what can I do? And he tells him that it's over. He rounds up all his family, and they ride past the cowboys, and they say, well, it's over. And the cowboys are not willing to leave it there, so they send out assassins for them as well. So you see,
and break into their family's dwelling.
Well, that happens when they kill Morgan and shoot Virgil, is that they also plan on killing their wives too. And they break down, open the door to shoot them. And that's actually an important part because, what's his name? Michael Rooker's character, McMasters, gives up the cowboys because he doesn't say you don't war on women, I guess. But anyway, they send Virgil and the women folk on the train away, And then Stephen Lang's Ike Clanton and another guy, I forget his name, are getting ready to shoot the Earps as they leave. And Wyatt Earp is behind them with a shotgun. And, he kills the one fellow, and Ike Clanton has survived so many parts in this movie. I love his character. Stephen Lang plays him amazingly well.
Yeah,
But
he's
he
definitely
sends him
my
into-
favorite supporting character.
Supporting character in this film.
He's very. The actor talks about trying to maintain a sense that he was not. Most of the documentation we have doesn't indicate that he was a coward, even though he's usually portrayed that way in films. So it's interesting the kind of like combination approach that they go for. That he's kind of almost he pretends like he's a coward in order to wheedle his way out of being shot, and then he turns around and rallies up the cowboys. So he's kind of a wheeler dealer.
In this case, he's sent as a messenger back to the Cowboys.
Right.
And this sets up the sequence of Wyatt Earp and his posse tracking down the remnants of the Cowboys. But really, at this point, still the Cowboys are pretty strong and goes after them.
Mm-hmm. So there's the second half of the movie kind of revolves around this rampage.
Yeah, this revenge ride. Which is, I think, interesting because there's this one part during the ride in this montage where Wyatt Earp kind of ducks behind his horse's head and shoots the guy that he's chasing from around the corner, like off his horse.
Mm-hmm.
And when you think about how difficult that would be, and compared to like the accuracy or historical accuracy of the OK Corral and how many bullets they were firing off, you think this would be almost impossible to do.
Right.
From a full gallop behind a horse at another man galloping at full speed. And it just kind of made me think about how this film is calling back to the older Westerns again. You kind of see that kind of shot in the 30s and maybe even the 20s.
Or even kind of like the Wild Bill Hickok and the rodeo shows.
Right, the Wild West shows.
Exactly, the kind of like trick riding and shooting and.
Right, so it's calling back to that older tradition again there.
Mm-hmm.
But they track them. The Cowboys kind of ambush them in this creek, and Wyatt Earp doesn't know what to do, so he kind of goes nuts here. He's like, "Not today," and he charges them in full 80s combat mode, kind of gone Rambo, and he's in the middle of the creek, and Curly Bill is like, okay, and he goes out and he gets killed by Wyatt Earp and then the other Cowboys run away, which sets up
despite
for
the fact that he basically empties his gun at Wyatt Earp and misses every time.
Yeah, like he's right there in the middle of the crossfire and he's not hit at all. And then, of course, Curly Bill gets killed, which sets up Johnny Ringo as the leader of the Cowboys for the final act of the film. But as soon after this, Doc gets really sick, and they take him to this ranch where Doc is being cared for.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Cowboys call McMasters to come talk about, a peace, or to kind of come back to the Cowboys, and Michael Rooker's character says no, and they kill him.
Mm-hmm. And
then they send a message saying that Johnny Ringo wants a showdown with Wyatt Earp. And so Wyatt Earp, down McMasters, and Doc being sick in bed, feels like he really has no choice but to face off against a gunslinger who's he acknowledges is a lot better at
mm-hmm.
the skill of a gun than he is. And he prepares himself for this meeting, and Doc kind of plays possum a little bit here. Says, "I want a badge just to kind of hold." And so Wyatt Earp says, "Okay," and gives him his badge, and then he kind of rides off going to this gunfight, and then you're kind of cut to Johnny Ringo waiting for Wyatt Earp and thinking that Wyatt Earp is coming to see him, when then suddenly you realize it's Doc Holliday meeting him. And they've had several interactions throughout the film, some really great memorable lines between the two of them.
Yeah. Including a battle of wits in Latin.
Yeah, they portray both these characters as educated gentlemen who have turned to the way of the gun.
Mm-hmm.
So it's an interesting. I'm sure that's a trope from an older Western as well, but I can't think of any at the top of my head where that comes from. But they face off in this final gunfight, and of course Doc wins. Wyatt Earp, hearing the gunshot, comes running in, trying to figure out who's in trouble, I guess, and finds that Doc has already killed Johnny Ringo.
Mm-hmm.
And
despite
then,
his very ill health at this point.
Yeah, Val Kilmer Doc Holliday, Val Kilmer's character, even says that it's like, I'm not as sick as I pretended to be. And then they say, well, let's finish this. And then I guess they kind of run down the rest of the Cowboys, except for Ike Clanton, who renounces his connection to the Cowboys. And if I remember right, in the end credits, they say that Ike Clanton was killed sometime later for some robbery or something like that.
Right.
So you don't actually see.
Never could straighten that boy out.
Never could. So
At least
anyway,
not the film version.
So we've finally reached the end of Tombstone.
Yeah, there's a few, I guess, housekeeping bits. I believe somewhere in there, Wyatt's wife dies.
No.
Or leaves him.
I think she just we're left to assume that she leaves him or he leaves her. They're not real specific about that.
Doc leaves his girlfriend, which is kind of a subplot.
That's true.
And he does eventually die of his tuberculosis.
He ends up in an institute for tubercular patients. And there's the scene where Wyatt Earp goes to see him, and Doc Holliday tells him to go find his actress.
Yeah.
Now, was this like an extended version that we got to watch, Ben?
I'm not sure which one it was, to be honest with you.
There's
a director's cut and a theatrical version.
In this version that we watched, Wyatt Earp actually goes to a theater and finds the actress, Josephine, I believe her name, and they, I guess, run off together.
Yep.
It's kind of snowing, and then they have this romantic kiss moment.
It's a very romantic thing.
I don't remember seeing that the first time I watched the film, but it's been a very long time since the first time I watched the film, and this time. So I don't know if that was in the actual theatrical version or if this was the director's cut that we watched.
We watched it on DVD, so I believe it is the director's cut.
Okay.
Which would make sense with your
I have a question
memory.
for you, Ben. What director are they talking about when they say director's cut?
That's a great question. So the director's audio commentary on the DVD is George Cosmatos.
Yeah.
Who's credited as the director on the film. But there's a little bit of complications on that. So should I get into the backstory?
Yes, please get into the backstory of this. I think it's a classic. I actually enjoyed this film a lot more than I'd say most of the other films that we watched in the series.
I agree. It's a classic Western. I don't know that it's one of my lesser favorites of the ones that we've watched. It's definitely in the bottom half for me.
For me, it's in the upper half.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it relies a little too heavily on nostalgia, and part of my reaction to it is I wasn't expecting, when you watch a movie about Wyatt Earp and the gunfight at the OK Corral,
right?
Your thought is always that the climax of the movie is going to be the fight at the OK Corral, because that's
Right.
kind of the way that we've been shaped to think of the event.
Which most movies, that's exactly what happens.
Right. I like the relationship between Wyatt and Doc. I think that's kind of what makes this movie special, is the relationship between those two characters that they created. And you need the second half of the story to tell that story through.
Right.
But the movie keeps wandering off into these other plots that aren't as engaging or aren't as well done.
Yeah.
I feel like they set up a lot of stuff with the cowboys that they perhaps could have explained better. Or we don't really follow the cowboys very much after that opening scene, where they were kind of like characters on their own without the Earp's involvement. But after that, I don't think they really appear without an Earp on the scene.
Do you think that was because of the kind of confusion going on and the change of directors?
I'm not entirely sure why. And it might not even be a legitimate criticism. It's just things that caught me kind of unawares. And those are the reasons that I wouldn't rank it as highly as perhaps you would. It is a very good movie. And an interesting kind of counterpoint to what Clint Eastwood was doing at the time, which was Unforgiven.
Right. Yeah, he did. That came out the year before.
Also kind of a legacy movie, but a different approach.
Yeah.
So this movie began life with a writer named Kevin Jarre. I assume it's pronounced Jar. It's Jarre. And he's actually the adopted son of a composer named Maurice Jarre, whose scores you've probably heard. He just did. He's famous for doing kind of rousing, high energy scores. I believe he does The Great Escape and Grand Prix and a bunch of large '60s movies. But anyway, Kevin Jarre is a writer, and he writes the script for Tombstone. And he was originally working with Kevin Costner to make a Wyatt Earp movie, and they had some disagreements about the direction that that Jarre was taking the script.
Yeah,
and they split off, and Kevin Costner went on to make his own Wyatt Earp movie, while Kevin Jarre was making this movie. And Kevin Jarre was assigned to direct, but by the time they got onto set, it became clear to most of the crew agree that he wasn't doing the best job of being a director, that he was sticking too close to the screenplay and not being free and taking too long to get the shots. The studio was anxious to get the movie made.
Right.
And so he's actually fired from directing from his directorial debut, it would have been, after shooting only a few scenes. I think the scenes with Charlton Heston's character are the scenes that he directed. But then different sources claim that they reshot all of that anyway. So it's hard to know if he directed any of the movie at all as far as finished footage that we've seen. And the director they bring in is George Cosmatos, who's known for doing genre films, particularly some horror films. He's worked with Sylvester Stallone a couple of times, a couple of sequels, and big budget genre pictures like Leviathan, which is a kind of sci-fi horror.
Yeah.
Take on the Alien Predator type of genre. So he's not really the person that you would think of when you think of a Western.
Yeah.
And he passed away in 2005. So about 12 years after this film comes out.
Yeah.
And later on, there kind of became more and more whisperings that even George Cosmatos was not the one really directing the movie. That Kurt Russell took the reins and is kind of the one that got the movie made. And it seems to me, this is based on my limited research, So take it for what it is. It seems to me that Kurt Russell definitely was very involved, perhaps more involved than a leading actor normally is, in making decisions on Tombstone. He's come out subsequently since Cosmato's death and said, I directed the film. I kept it a secret while George was alive to protect his integrity and his reputation because I respect him as a director, but I really just didn't want credit for directing at the time. And I was stepping up to the plate and kind of carrying the movie.
Yeah. But some of his co-stars, including Sam Elliott, actually kind of back him up on that statement.
Right. Some of the co-stars do, but some of them, nearly all of them, do that with kind of reservation.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some sort of controversy there. A lot of the behind-the-scenes footage that I've seen shows Cosmatos directing. And of course, all that could be staged. So to me, it's a bit of a mystery, and I think there's probably some sections where there's some overlap.
Yeah.
But I'm not ready to completely dismiss Cosmatos' input and say that Kurt Russell directed the movie and Cosmatos was just a name to put on the marquee. Kind of like, it's similar to what people say about Return of the Jedi, which was directed by Richard Marquand, but people say that George Lucas held the reins so tightly as a producer that he was the one actually calling the shots. Or there's one or two Spielberg movies that people have said that about too. I can't think of which ones off the top of my head. But I'm not really sure, not having been there. And the reports from set vary.
Right.
And so, it is, of course, credible that Russell might have waited till Cosmatos had passed on before he revealed his true colors. But it's also plausible that he waited until there was no one to contradict him to jump in and change the story.
Okay.
So yeah, a bit of a mystery, depending on who you ask. There's an article on True West Magazine has an interview with Kurt Russell, where he kind of tells his side of the story. So don't just take my word for it, but go check that out and hear it from the horse's mouth. So to kind of continue the alternate version, the Wyatt Earp movie that never was, or that was but was different. Kevin Costner went forward and made his Wyatt Earp movie, which is kind of more about the life of Wyatt Earp generally. Yeah. And it's a very big, long movie. I feel like Tombstone is kind of long. Wyatt Earp is much longer.
I think Wyatt Earp is like twice as long.
Yeah, it's a whopper. I've never actually successfully made it through Wyatt Earp, despite having good reasons to try.
I feel like I've seen it once, but I don't remember if I made it all the way through.
Yeah, it's a bit of a whopper. So it comes out 6 months after Tombstone. Tombstone was a hit, not a massive hit, but definitely in the top movies of that year. It makes $50 million at the box office, which is twice its budget of $25 million.
That's pretty substantial right there.
That's a respectable gross for a film. Now you think about advertising and promoting a movie of that scale, it probably costs around $25 million. But that puts you in the territory of, well, now we've made our budget back in the box office. Everything we make in home video is profit. And of course, home video was booming in this time in the 90s. VHS was king, and subsequently DVD and Blu-ray. So that I'm sure the film has done quite well on the books over the years. Wyatt Earp, by contrast, cost about $65 million and returned something like $17 million, I want to say.
I think it's a little bit better than that. I was just looking at the numbers. It's like 25 million.
25 million. So it's interesting the kind of like flip-flop there between $25 million budget, $50 million profit, over $50 million budget, $25 million income. It's a bit of a swap between the two.
But of course, Wyatt Earp comes later, and it's like twice as long. So I guess that makes
so it's a different
sense.
And it released at a different time of year. Time of year makes a big difference in when movies come out and how they're received by the public. So it's interesting. The writer of Wyatt Earp is a man called Dan Gordon, and Dan claimed that the picture was butchered by Costner and the studio, that they totally wrecked his vision of a life story for Wyatt Earp, and he actually writes a novel about Wyatt Earp. That's won a few awards and is out and around somewhere. So if you're interested in a novel about the life of Wyatt Earp, look for Dan Gordon's book.
I'll probably try to look that up.
I would like to find it and read it, but I've never found a copy of it. It's also worth noting that this is a pretty clear example. Both of these movies are pretty clear examples of with the Costamos Jar Russell dilemma and the Dan Gordon kind of refusing to accept blame for the failure of Wyatt Earp. It's a confirmation of the truism that success has many fathers, but failure is always an orphan. I think that's definitely true in the case of these two movies.
Well, so what's happening in the 90s? This movie comes out in 93.
Mm-hmm.
And that's well into the 90s by that point. So the 90s has two U.S. presidents that we see, George Bush and Bill Clinton. George Bush is kind of a leftover from the Reagan administration. He tries to distance himself a little bit. He was the vice president, so he distances himself a little bit as he's getting elected for president, and even changes some of the policies that he didn't really agree with under Reagan. But for the most part, a lot of people see him as kind of a continuation of that Reagan era.
Mm-hmm.
And then Bill Clinton gets elected and becomes president in 1993. So that's kind of the turning point at that point. And Bill Clinton will continue to be president throughout the next 8 years. So he'll finish up the 90s. So I would kind of say the 90s are pretty much the Clinton era in many ways.
Is it fair to say that George Herbert Walker Bush was kind of a more moderate version of Reagan?
I think that is fair to say. I think in the 1980s Republicans are trying to figure out who they are for the most part, and Reagan was so successful that a lot of people were still underneath that mold, trying to mold themselves after Reagan. And Bush kind of sees himself, but we can change our perception of Republicans, and we still have a lot of fluid here. So he's very much of a moderate. Mm-hmm. But then on the other hand, Bill Clinton, who is a Democrat, is also very much a moderate.
Right.
So you kind of see the 90s becoming very middle ground in a lot of issues. You kind of see that very moderate philosophy. I think that's probably why today's politics seems so crazy, because the 90s kind of had the center portion for so long.
That in a way isn't really typical.
Yeah, that's true.
I think people of our generation look back on the 90s and think of it as our normal because that's where we grew up.
Yeah.
But I think
looking back at the 70s and 80s, I think you're right. I think the 90s is kind of an abnormal middle ground for both parties.
Kind of an anomaly politically.
Yeah. There are a few big events that happen. One, I think we've been kind of mentioning throughout the whole series, of course, is the Cold War. The Cold War finally comes to an end during the late 80s and the early 90s. And so in 1990, the East and West Germany are reunited, and the Soviet Union fully collapses. So they start breaking down the Berlin Wall. And that's in April through October, that East and West Germany finally are united, and the Berlin Wall just comes down. Also in 1990, Margaret Thatcher resigns as prime minister. Poland, his first direct presidential election, fellow by the name of Lech Walesa. So Poland is no longer underneath that the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm.
In 91, Mikhail Gorbachev resigns. The Cold War officially ends and is dissolved. Conservative members of the party try to depose Gorbachev in a coup d'etat. But his, I forget what Boris Yeltsin really is to him, but he's kind of he's not a political ally in any sense, but Boris Yeltsin kind of defends him and will eventually become president of Russia. Wow. And it's Boris Yeltsin who kind of will take Russia into the next generation of their history.
Mm-hmm.
So that's happening in the early 90s there. Another interesting thing is technology. You see a lot of technology happening in the 90s. In the space race, the Hubble telescope is launched in 1990.
Mm-hmm.
And Tim Berners-Lee publishes a formal proposal for the World Wide Web. And in 91, the World Wide Web will become become a public service, or be publicly accessible.
Wow.
So you have the end of the Cold War and the beginning of the internet.
Pandora's box pops open.
Once more.
Once more.
Yeah. Because of the end of the Cold War, you see a lot of I think you see a lot of conflict in the 90s. Mm-hmm. So the Gulf War will take place in 91. That doesn't directly connected to the Cold War, but I think Saddam Hussein, who had been kind of allied to the U.S. In a way, just kind of keep away from the Soviets,
mm-hmm.
kind of becomes a loose cannon in 91. And he's like, the Americans are not going to do anything if I decide to, say, invade Kuwait,
right?
Which he will do. And the United States does something, and there's a coalition that forces him out.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the Gulf War in 91, which actually is a boon to Bush and to American patriotism or spirit, mm-hmm. because they're so worried about having another Vietnam.
Right.
That they kind of push them out of Kuwait and then just stay there at the border. They don't go into Iraq.
Right, and it becomes less of a quagmire. At least so it appeared at the time. So yeah, they have all these set goals. They accomplish all the goals. They say, "Yay, it's a victory," and they let Saddam Hussein continue running Iraq. So it's kind of interesting comparing the first Gulf War with the 21st century Gulf War. Yeah, very.
We talked a little bit about the AIDS epidemic in the 80s, mm-hmm. right?
Yeah,
well, in the early 90s, in 91, Magic Johnson comes out and says that he had contracted HIV, which was a big deal because he is, I think, probably the first straight celebrity to admit that he had contracted HIV.
Right.
So that was a big deal because up to that point, a lot of public perception was that only gays had AIDS.
Right.
So this was a kind of a big deal, but this was more than a gay issue. It was a worldwide health issue.
Yeah.
And also, lead singer Freddie Mercury dies of AIDS in 91.
Mm-hmm.
In 1992, there's another issue that I kind of want to touch on before we move on. the Rodney King riots. So
yes.
right now, we're been seeing a lot of riots or protests regarding police brutality, and this is not a new thing. In 1992,
Specifically, police brutality and racism.
Yes, Rodney King was a motorist in Los Angeles, and he was pulled over. Apparently, he tried to resist or something like that, and 4 police officers beat him to death. And this was caught on camera. And these 4 police officers were tried and then acquitted, which caused a huge uproar in the African American community and what they call the Los Angeles riots now. And that happened in 92.
Yeah.
So that's not a new thing.
Amazing how we can still be dealing with the same issues today.
Yeah, that's 30 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
We're still dealing with that issue. See what else before I'm kind of caught in the 90s, 92 and 93. In 93, the Branch Davidians have a standoff in Waco, Texas, where 81 people were killed, including the leader David Koresh, and that kind of sparks some of that conversation about gun control and different things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Don't Ask, Don't Tell is signed, which prohibits gays from openly serving in the military, but it requires that they can serve, but their commanding officers just can't ask them their sexual orientation, which is a compromise that Clinton worked out that neither side was very happy with. So it became a kind of pretty big political nightmare there. Russia and the United States continue to talk. They have a treaty, START 2, which talks about kind of bringing their nuclear weapons down again.
Mm-hmm.
The Oslo Accords are taking place in 93. Israeli and Palestine are talking about peace, which is a very big deal.
Yeah.
I think that may have been the first time the two had really sat down together and talked.
Right. Wow.
94, the North American Free Trade Agreement goes into effect, NAFTA.
Mm-hmm.
That was a big deal for Clinton. And then, of course, the sexual harassment scandals started piling up, starting with Paula Jones, popped up in 94. And then by 1998, the Monica Lewinsky case will be in full swing.
Monica Lewinsky? Who was that?
You're joking, right?
I am joking.
So that was a big scandal, and I think that's probably been the most memorable part of Clinton's administration.
Right, yeah.
Which is kind of unfortunate when you think about some of the other issues that were coming up during the 90s.
Yeah, a lot of interesting stuff.
Also kind of connected to the Cold War, the Eastern European bloc, all those smaller countries that were part of the Soviet Union, start breaking up. Mm-hmm. Yugoslavia is breaking up in a number of different pieces, and so you have issues in Bosnia with ethnic cleansing, Kosovo in 98.
Right, yeah.
And there's some other things going on there as well. As Czechoslovakia will break up too, from Czechoslovakia to Czech Republic and Slovakia.
Right.
But not nearly as violent as those other parts. And we talk about Bosnia and Kosovo. But technology will be, I think, the one positive thing that keeps getting pushed through is that the internet. eBay is founded in 95. Amazon had already been founded by that time, Amazon.com.
Mm-hmm. We're sort of moving towards the .com boom.
Yeah. Ask Jeeves is created in 96, which was one of the first
search engines.
Can you imagine a world without search engines?
It's hard to picture now.
No Google.
It's become such a part of our day-to-day life.
Yeah. Like, how many times do you Google stuff in a day?
Oh, man, I don't even know.
Search engine Google is founded in 98, by the way.
Wow.
Yeah. So there really was a time without Google.
BG.
Also, in the kind of the science technology route, cloning becomes an issue. In '97,
yeah.
Dolly the sheep had been cloned, so kind of bring that up.
We don't talk about cloning as much anymore.
No, it was a big issue in the late '90s and early 2000s.
Yeah, there was a lot of ethical concerns.
Yeah,
but it's kind of
and
moved off the radar screen now for whatever reason. I'm not really sure why that just kind of vanished. Maybe they
I
never
don't
really
have
perfected the technique or found
I
a
mean,
way to do it.
there is still cloning experiments, but it became such a moral concern that a lot of countries outlawed it outright.
Right.
So there's still some experiments. I've heard of mice being cloned and some other things, but the issue of it becoming a human clone was such an issue that a lot of places I just outlawed it.
Right.
I don't know if it just wasn't lucrative enough, or couldn't perfect the technology, or what the deal was on that.
Fascinating.
I'm kind of going back to technology. Napster '99, which will become a huge issue in the early 2000s.
Yeah, it changed the industry.
Yeah. But we talked about gun control. Columbine happens in '99.
Right.
Which I don't think is the first school shooting, but it definitely is the biggest. It certainly sparks a huge debate and conversation about guns in school and kids and things like that.
Yeah.
In '99, the day of 6 billion, proclaimed 6 billionth living human in the world is born. So we hit 6 billion people in 1999.
So many of us.
Which we're more now. I think we made it over 7 billion.
Yeah. We've increased exponentially.
So there's a lot of stuff going on in the 90s. I have a very long list here. It's like 6 pages long, but I tried to streamline that because no one really wants me to read off it year by year of what's happening in the 90s. So I think the big issue, some of the big topics there, being the Cold War ending and kind of the aftermath of that, science and technology really taking off and becoming much more center to our lives, like Google and Amazon. There's some pop culture stuff in here too, if you want to hear.
Yeah.
In 1997, I think it's 97. Yeah, the first Harry Potter book was published.
Right.
So think about that for a minute.
Now, was that an immediate success? I feel like it kind of took some time to snowball and become a
Honestly,
big international.
I don't remember the first book coming out. I guess, kind of young, and I also wasn't allowed to read them. Because they had to do with witchcraft. So my parents were like, "You don't watch those, or don't read those, and later don't watch the movies." I remember one of the later books becoming extremely popular around Christmas time when they were getting ready to ship out, and there were like millions of copies already bought and hadn't even shipped out yet.
Pre-sold.
And it was I forget if that was the 6th or the 7th. Well, I guess there's not 7 books. I guess it was just 6.
There's 7.
Is there 7 books? Mark McGwire hits his 70 home runs to break the single season record, which actually has a big deal with rejuvenating baseball. Apparently, baseball as a sport had fallen off.
Yeah, it kind of slumps a little bit.
And then with the whole home run race, because I think Mark McGwire was racing with Sammy Sosa. Maybe I'm reading that wrong.
No, I think you're right.
He made 70 home runs in a single season, which was the record at the time.
Yeah, I remember I had his baseball card from a box of cereal.
Oh wow! Then didn't he in the early 2000s? He had the whole steroid thing, right?
I think so. Yeah.
So I'll have to look that up.
His record on the Hall of Fame was denoted with an asterisk because of that.
Yeah, tarnished, which I think caused baseball to kind of slump again too.
Right.
Everybody's like, "Oh, they're all on steroids."
Baseball in general, that because of cable sports kind of rising in the '90s with ESPN gaining some market share, there's a lot of increase in action sports. BMX kind of becomes a thing.
Oh, right. Yeah.
So you have these more high speed, action intense sports, and baseball has a lot of dead time.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's more of a slower sport in comparison.
It's fun to watch in person. I haven't been able to sit and watch a whole game on TV, but it is a lot of fun to watch in person. I've been to a couple games.
I will always fondly remember watching, I think it was the 2007 World Series where the Red Sox finally won. That was an enjoyable series.
But that is the next decade.
Yes, it is. I'm skipping ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, you're skipping ahead. Kind of getting into our own childhood memories here.
Yeah, we're both officially on the scene.
Yeah.
You were born in the 80s and I was born in the 90s.
Yep. No, I guess no timeline would be any timeline would be remiss for the 1990s without the Y2K scare.
Yes.
Do you remember that?
I do remember that.
So yeah, I remember waiting up till midnight that New Year's.
Yeah, I do too.
Wondering what would happen. So we're all still here.
My family was not concerned about it
at all.
No, they thought it was all hooey, and we're not worried.
I don't really remember. I don't think my family were all that worried because I remember most of my siblings and my parents had all gone to bed for that New Year's. But I was kind of concerned. I was kind of interested to see what would happen, if anything.
Yeah, it did seem like there were some legitimate concerns. Also, that's my earliest memory of toilet paper hoarding being a thing, which is also relevant to 2020. Yeah, I remember a lot of people were buying toilet paper, and toilet paper was hard to find all of a sudden.
I don't remember that.
In 1999.
1999.
At least where I was living. Maybe that wasn't a worldwide problem.
Well, I'm sure it was. I just was 12 years old and not thinking about toilet paper that much.
Well, I would have been 7 years old, and that was all I could think about. So there you go.
Well, 7 years old. That's a big deal. Having plenty of PP.
Yeah, I remember there was a lot of celebration. The 1990s were kind of an important time in film history because there's kind of an independent cinema movement for the first time.
Yeah.
Where the technology has gotten to the point where almost anybody can get access to a camera and produce some high quality footage. There's the Sundance Film Festival has kind of been created and established as a place where not just where movies of all different kinds can get seen, but also where movies can get purchased. And there's a big boom in spec scripts, which are scripts written by unknown authors and then being bought by Hollywood studios to turn into movies. So it's an important year in an important decade in movie history also.
That is interesting. I hadn't really thought through that.
Yeah, Tombstone is interesting because it's a more traditional picture kind of in the middle of this melee. Steven Soderbergh came on the scene with a movie called Sex, Lies, and Videotape. The Coen brothers becoming more established by this time, and we'll talk about them more in a future episode. But you're starting to see more and more independent cinema and cinema that's, I guess, less traditional and less confined by Hollywood standards.
Yeah.
Both in terms of content and in terms of technology. Because one of the biggest hits of the decade is a movie called Blair Witch Project, which was shot on little home video cameras. Some
That's
early
right.
digital technology.
That was a big deal.
It's a huge deal. Shot for very little money, made a great deal of money.
Yeah.
It was for a long time the highest. In fact, it may still be the biggest ratio of profits to budget ever. So that's just a little snapshot of the 90s.
Yeah.
Thank you for your research. There's a lot that we could talk about.
There's a lot to talk about.
But I
think we have we reached the end of our time.
We have reached the end. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for joining us. If you joined us way back on episode 1 with the Great Train Robbery, thanks for riding that train all this way with us. We really appreciate it. We've enjoyed having you along.
There is one more episode, remember, Ben.
There's one more to come. We're talking about No Country for Old Men for the 2000s.
And I am very excited. I've never seen No Country for Old Men.
No, I actually haven't either. So
This is going to be exciting.
A good time for both of us. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss that episode. You can get your episodes downloaded automatically to your podcast player of choice, whether you're using Stitcher or Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts or whatever tool you're using. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything or any of our fabulous minisodes also.
And tell your friends.
Pass it on.
We are on Twitter and Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube.
We're like the legend of Wyatt Earp. The more you share us, the bigger we become.
Okay.
That kind of broke,
yeah.
That kind of broke down.
We'll work on it. Maybe Wyatt Earp should become our new logo.
Don't forget to vote if you want to hear me singing a theme song from the Aristocats. There's still a poll up on... Is it on Twitter?
There is a poll on Twitter. The poll actually just says for you to watch Aristocats. I was suggested that you should live stream yourself singing it. But I can put a new poll up if people want to see that.
If you want to see that, then definitely reach out to us. Send us an email, popstorian@gmail.com. We're on Twitter @popstorian, on Instagram @popstorian, on YouTube @popstorian, Facebook Popstorian.
Popstorian.
Popstorian is basically the gist of what we're trying to say.
I wish we could get like Morgan Freeman to say Popstorian for us.
Popstorian. 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 Morgan Freeman.
All right. Probably enough.
Bye. We'll see you next time.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Popstorian podcast. Be sure to subscribe. You can find us online at popstorian.com or on Facebook and Twitter. Tune in next time for more of the history of popular culture.